Great. Thank you so much, everyone, and welcome back to the People Online. So I wanted to just take a quick moment to talk a little bit about what we did in Workshop 1, because we're now at Workshop 2, and actually, could I just see a show of hands? How many people either went or watched online? Oh, a good number. Great. That's really good, because we really set this up as a series so it would build. But if you're just coming in now, especially if you're just coming in online, and you weren't at Workshop 1, we're starting at governance, which is really, really important, but sometimes it's not the best place to start. So we have Workshop 1, the whys and hows of data collection. It's also available online. I was still able to locate mine from May. I was really proud of that. And it talks about the different types of data, and then it talks about why you should collect patient data, why organizations should collect patient data, what model is right for you. It talks a little bit about the differences between contact registries, clinical patient registries, natural history studies, and biobanks. And for each group, these are distinct things that are going to be appropriate for different groups. And so if you're just starting out, you're seeing some groups who've been around for a long time, don't be overwhelmed. Everybody had to start somewhere. And if you're already somewhere in the journey, you might be wanting to build and expand, and that's really, really exciting. So wherever you're at, it's a great place to be, and you can just continue to evolve. But one of the first worksheets, if you haven't done it, I think it would be kind of useful. It talks a little bit about some of the different building blocks, but it's about how you want to plan your data collection, what kind of information you want to collect, how many people do you want to enroll, are you interested in biologic samples, if so, what kinds, who's going to be eligible to participate, who's going to help you create your plan. And there was a talk that I gave last time in the session that really went into detail about a lot of these things, as well as working with your scientific advisors. So it's going to look like with this talk that we're just kind of starting here, but all of the building blocks that lead up to it are in that previous talk. So feel free to go back and listen to it. And then right now we're going to talk about the data trust and governance. This is Workshop 2. And there's a really useful Well, there's wonderful stuff about informed consent, and Meg did a lovely, lovely job this morning. And there's a lot of detail about informed consent. And I know it's on page 11, and I can't find page 11. There it is. This whole planning for governance, we're going to talk about this a little bit in the talk, but this is a really useful worksheet to fill out to help figure out where you are and what kinds of questions you need to answer. I'll just do this so I can find it again. Okay. So what is governance? So AHRQ, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, they define governance as guidance and high-level decision-making covering the following key functions. And we made this, in the workbook, this nice graphic of pillars where it's defining your objectives, identifying stakeholders, building your team, all the LC issues, sort of the ethical, legal, society, that's where the IRB falls in, privacy, and ensuring sustainability. And these are all the things that make up good governance. And we're not going to talk about all of them today, but feel free if there are parts of this that you're really interested in to ask in the questions. So why do we want to practice good governance? Because you've been hearing all day, governance is important, governance is important. Well, that's great, but why is it important? It's going to provide a roadmap for clear decision making. It's going to help facilitate transparency. It's going to create a level playing field for stakeholder engagement. And it's going to build credibility of your research because it's going to be clear how you're making decisions. And it's going to make your day-to-day operations easier. So having this plan in place is really, really vital. And many people ask me, hey, do you have an example of governance policy that I can look at? But the thing is, I just can't give you my governance policy because your needs are probably different. So you really have to think about what you need for your resource. And I'm happy to talk you through it, but just saying, here, this is mine, it's not one size fits all. But practicing good governance really makes your day-to-day life easier with these resources. So what happens without good governance? I wanted to share a story with you of two geneticists, and this is from the early 2000s. I was a lot newer to this whole space. And I was working on a project where there were 2 geneticists, and there was a box of very valuable research samples from a cohort of patients that they were looking for the gene that caused X. And in the arrangement, and this was funded by a patient group, a patient advocacy group, in the arrangement, the box of samples were stored in one of the geneticist's freezer in her lab. And that led to a lot of distrust between the geneticist and the larger community, because the other geneticist thought that she was going into the freezer at night, in the middle of the night, and pulling out samples and running experiments to try to beat him to the gene. And the point of this is, it doesn't, I mean, I don't think she was doing that, but it doesn't matter if she was or she wasn't, because that was the perception. And the perception was that it wasn't a level playing field, and all of the resources were going to this researcher. And geneticists can be competitive, researchers are competitive, and these two were kind of frenemies. And if we had just had a good governance policy in place, that we would have said, here are the rules. This is how, the rules of engagement, this is how it's going to work. It would have helped us a lot, and there wouldn't have been as much mistrust and distrust. And all of that honestly made my job a lot harder, because I couldn't get everyone on the same page. So when you have good governance and you can say, well, this is how we make decisions, this is how they're made, it can really, really help you. So this is the Planning for Good Governance worksheet. And it talks you through about planning for your IRB submission. Because the IRB is part of your governance. We're going to talk a lot about the governance policy. The IRB is part of it, but it's not all of it. And obviously you're going to have a principal investigator. Someone's going to develop and write the protocol. Someone's going to do the submission. And then you need to include information about how you're going to protect privacy, how are you going to obtain informed consent. And a lot of this is in the workbook, and there are a lot of resources from SAGE as well. But really just knowing how you're going to operationalize that and who is going to do what. And then you can go back and say, oh, well, Susie said she would submit the IRB protocol. Susie, how's the protocol coming? So, it's really important to add some responsibility into this as you're filling it out. Another really important part is ownership and access. Who's going to own your data or samples, and who's going to make decisions about them? Who determines who gets to access them, and what are the processes, and are they clear and transparent? And I think that especially for researchers, if they know what's being asked of them to get access, that just makes it much, much easier. And there also will be data sharing agreements or material transfer agreements that will be part of the IRB. And there are example ones out there, and there are going to be probably some additional things you'll want to put in for each project. And they go to the IRB. And then you also need to know if you'll be returning results to participants, and what that looks like and how they'll be returned. And this is a good place to start, but knowing who's in charge and who's making those decisions, it's really, really important. So when I was putting this together, because this is kind of even though I really like governance, this is kind of a dry and boring topic. And when you say, hey, governance policy, your board might just go, oh, yay. So we talk about governance policy versus the research protocol, and where are they similar, where do they overlap, and where are they different? So the research protocol is really all about the science. What are you collecting? Who will you collect it from? Who are you going to enroll? How will you collect it? Is it data? Is it samples? Who's actually going to do the collection? Where will you store it? And how will you distribute it? And that all goes into the IRB application, as well as other data use agreements, material transfer agreements, the templates for those. And those will often get negotiated at the institution when you want to give data or samples to a researcher. You send this document, and their tech transfer redlines it and sends it back, and you kind of go back and forth. And every institution makes different changes. I'm on a project where I've negotiated about 40 of them, and I can tell you that all the changes are different. And it's an interesting adventure. But the governance policy is all about decision making, and that doesn't go to the IRB. It's about, because when you make changes to your protocol, you have to send it back to the IRB. So your governance policy is saying, who's going to have access, when will they have access, Who determines what the access is? What are the requirements? Do they have to fill out an application? Is there a review process? Do they have to agree to certain things? And then who makes decisions about it? And in general, the governance policy itself is an IRB approved, but there are parts of it that are important that are part of the research protocol. So I hope I didn't make that more confusing, but there's sort of two different things. And think about governance all about decision making. So what should be in your governance policy? And this is the part where you just can't say, hey, here's my governance policy. You can apply it. You can apply key principles. So who are the key personnel and who makes those decisions? I work on a project where we provide samples to researchers creating new diagnostics. But I'm the principal investigator, but I don't make the decisions about the samples. The board does. And that it gives me a nice little buffer because the board is actually the one that approves or doesn't approve the applications. I get to make a recommendation, but it kind of creates a space, which is really good for me because I'm the one interacting one-on-one with all of the researchers and companies and investigators. If you have an application process and what is involved in that. And I think that in terms of an application process, you don't want to make it overly burdensome, but these are the data from your community, so you want to know who's going to be using it and what are they going to be what they're going to be using it for. There are a lot of examples in research where people collected data under one pretense and used data for something else, and that really led to distrust. And there are some high-profile cases really within the last decade. So when a researcher is using your data, you want to know what questions are they asking. And a lot of times you'll put things in it that this is your application to study this research question, and they can't go study other things without coming back and asking you if it's okay. Is there a review process? And Megan talked a lot about the review process that they use at the PMS Foundation. You might need to get outside reviewers. For some of the ones that I'm working on, it's diagnostic companies with a lot of algorithms and things that I need people that really understand the technology to look at because I don't have that expertise. So you can incorporate a review process, and then reviewers can make recommendations, but then you need to have an approval process, and what does that look like? And very often it might be the board that's doing the approval, or there might be a research committee that does the approval. Do you have cost recovery or pricing in your model? And this is a topic that I think is controversial is not the right word, but research is expensive, and there's a lot of money going into research, and I don't think it's asking too much to asking researchers to provide some nominal compensation for time because you're pulling the data from them, for them, you're having to do a lot on your end, and we've done that for our sample collection, build in a cost recovery model. No one's ever going to be able to pay for the true cost of collecting the data or collecting the sample, but just trying to get some sustainability because there is going to be some overhead on these projects. And then once someone's approved and you tell them they're approved, and you depending on how involved the process is, you want to do this in as timely a manner as possible. But then what's the process for the approved applicants to receive the information, whether it's data or samples? And what are the requirements for them to receive it? So there's probably a data use agreement, or there's a material transfer agreement. You probably have things in there about them acknowledging you in publications. There's always going to be things about you will not try to re-identify the participants, even if you have other information on them. You won't try to recontact them. And then what are you asking the researchers to give back to you as the organization? Because patients and families really want to know what's happening with their data. So we always require a lay summary. And in one of my projects, I give the samples blinded, so they don't know which ones are the cases or the controls. And they don't get to know until they tell me what they found. And then we work through all the data. But they're doing it in a blinded way, and it's also, from a research standpoint, it's a little more agnostic. So what do they have to give back to you? And you make sure those are in the agreements. And then those agreements are then enforceable. What's the record keeping requirements for everything I just mentioned. You're probably going to have some big spreadsheets that logs when something came in, did you send it out for review, how long did it take, what's the turnaround time? We had a project where we realized it was taking too long, and one of the biggest gaps, at least for us, has always been sometimes there was a backlog in an institution to review the MTA, and sometimes we would send it and we wouldn't hear from them for like 2 months. But then that was adding to our overall process. So we did some things we couldn't change that, but we tried to decrease some of the other intervals to get the process shorter. And we also set up a system that if you come back for more data or samples, your process is much shorter because we've already negotiated all of this, we just need to change this last page. So there are things you can do to be more nimble and more flexible. And all the documents that are related to the above processes are part of this policy as well, just even referencing them, this application, the instructions, et cetera. And you always want a version number and a date. That's very, very important. And I know this sounds like a lot, but it doesn't have to be a lot. And the more you do this, the more involved it might become. But what should be included? So I mentioned documents. So if there's any applications, instructions, if you have a review process, Megan talked about the capacity review and the merit review. There's instructions for the reviewers that say this is what you're looking for, any score sheets. And if you have reviewers, even if they're internal to your foundation or external, you need to have them sign conflicts of interest forms because people shouldn't be reviewing things where they have a conflict. And so a conflict might be that they've worked directly with the person submitting the application. Maybe that was their graduate student or their postdoc. Sometimes if they're at the same institution, if they're in the same department, that's usually a conflict. If it's a really, really big institution, like the University of Michigan, and they're in completely different departments, that might not be a conflict, but someone just needs to look and make sure there are no conflicts. And you tell them, the researchers, if you're gonna review this here, these are the things that would be a conflict. And the thing is with COI forms, many of the people that will be reviewing applications, they review grants, they have to sign this stuff all the time. This is very common for scientists, so asking them to do this is not really, it's not a high bar. People are very willing to do it. And when you ask someone, hey, can you review this application? This is the application, if you're not conflicted, and they'll just be like, oh, actually, I can't because I'm working on a very similar project or I've worked with them in the past. And it works pretty well. And then the agreements, the data access agreement and the material transfer agreement. And the base agreement should also be reviewed by the IRB. So again, how do you actually create this? Well, you just have to start writing it down. Start with a bulleted list. Who makes those decisions? And it might be very small. It might just be like, we're a small registry and there are 2 people on our committee and we decide if people have access. And that's okay, that's a governance policy because you're saying these are the people that make the decisions. You might want to, it might be more expansive. Often it's usually not the full board. I have a very nimble board of 3 people. It's usually, like if you have a 12-person board, you're not gonna have the whole board make decisions. You might have a subset of the board or a committee of the board if you involve the board. And with all the things I kind of mentioned, not all of those categories apply, but in your unique situation, there might be additional categories that are needed. So for instance, in Megan's project, they have genetic data. So they have a lot of different kinds of rules around who can access genetic data, because genetic data now we're different. Now we can identify people with that. That's very different than some of this de-identifiable data that we've been talking about. So if you have genetic data, and I know in their case, and she'll correct me in the Q&A if I don't get this right, in their case, they don't ever share the genetic reports, but they've aggregated some of the information, the summary information from the reports, and then that can be available to researchers. But the researchers never get those original reports. So you may need to customize it based on the type of data that you're collecting in your unique situation. And you need to review this at least yearly and revise it as needed. I mean, governance is dynamic, and Terry talked about this really well this morning. It's changing. There might be a new drug that's coming into into this area, into the disease space, and you might need new questions, and there might be different kinds of data that you start collecting. Maybe you're collecting wearable data now, and does that fit into your policy, and do you need to make changes? And if something doesn't quite fit the policy, it's a sign you need to revise it. And it's a good idea just to go back and just make sure everything's working as it should. And you should acknowledge special use cases. We had an example where there was a really large federal program for funding. And they had a very, very extensive review process that had patient advocates with that disease, so like really knowledgeable people that were reviewing it to make sure it was relevant to the community. And we were like, you know, the burden was so high for them to get this money, they really don't need to go through our review process because they've already done all the things. We just need to decide, you know, does the project make sense? And so as we found these special use cases, we just kept revising it. And it's really a living, breathing document, and it's just really important. So I'm going to be short and brief here because I know will give us a lot of time for questions, and it's so funny. I just keep saying governance is important, but you really need to make time for good governance, and you need to get buy-in from key stakeholders. And you know, I think it was Terry that talked about this: getting buy-in from the board, getting buy-in from the patient community. You might want to have patient leaders and representatives as part of your review process. I mean, you definitely want to, but just figuring out how it works best for your organization. And you need to be nimble in an evolving research landscape, because it really is changing, and it's changing quickly. And there are special use cases. They do exist. Be sure to include them. And if something new comes up that doesn't fit, you can review your policy, change your policy, and then move forward. You just have to make sure that when you're making those decisions, it reflects the current policy. And write it down. Again, when you start out, this might be a bulleted list that's 1 page long. It doesn't have to be fancy. It just has to be your roadmap about how you're going to make decisions. And recognize one size doesn't fit all. What works for me might not work for you. The review process might be too burdensome. You want to get the data out to researchers, but there are definitely, in many fields, there are areas that are slightly controversial, so you might want to have a little more structure around those kinds of things. And especially when you get into genetics, there's often a lot more structure. And don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because you have to start somewhere, and where you're starting is a great place to start, and give yourselves credit for starting. And then just as this evolves, when it's not working, then go back and review it and change it so it works. And so I have a lot of time left over, which I want to open up to questions. And, oh, I see Pam now. It's really bright up here.
Monica.
And feel free to ask me anything, because
She went right back. You do.
Yeah, you do.
For recording. And we'll actually have you stand up, please. Thank you.
Okay, kind of have, I don't know, a twofold question, I guess. I just kind of wanted to poll, because part of our governance within our own registry, you know, mechanism, I guess, is we have our board members sign non-disclosure agreements along with the charter committee that's overseeing the registry. I just wanted to know how many of you actually do that, require that, because when you're looking at protocols, for example, you know, Berkeley, you know, if they send a protocol for our researchers to look at, and of course it's just an abstract, but you don't, of course, you know, when the researchers are looking at it to make sure it's a good study, it's something that we want to release the data for, because you don't want to, no one wants to get scooped, right?
Right.
You know, so.
So that's a very, very good practice, and yes, we do that. And also for my board that makes the approvals, I make them sign a conflict of interest as well, so they would have to disclose that. But I think the non-disclosure piece, especially with research protocols, that builds credibility of your organization. And so, so when a researcher, you just say, oh yeah, and you know, this will go to the board, but everyone signs this and it won't get disclosed, and that helps build trust. So anyone else do that in practice? We're gonna be interactive after lunch.
And then I had another.
But that was a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, well, kind of what ties into that is because, you know, and one of the issues that we have had is because we have an international registry, and building up an international community to try to be a part of that charter, they have a problem with signing a non-disclosure agreement. I guess either because of the legal language, maybe their understanding of what they're actually doing. So there's kind of a resistance because we're wanting to build an international representation. So I guess, how do you overcome those kind of challenges?
So I'm going to ask Terry if she has any thoughts on that, because I'm really just working in the U.S. right now, so I don't know. It's okay. Thank you, Terry.
Yeah, we haven't approached the board of directors to sign that disclosure statement. And the way the International Registry works for us is that it's patient. It's a patient-driven, patient data in registry system. And so they are already signing their consents or electronic consents. But we haven't taken it to the point where their specific organization board of directors now needs to sign an additional consent because of a potential research project that might be taking place from a researcher. That almost becomes a third-party entity. That party's coming in, they're extrapolating that data out, they're accessing the data, but our patients have already consented to it. Some of our board of directors are families of patients. And so we don't have that other tier. So can you explain why you feel it's necessary to have the other tier for the board?
At the request of the community, they wanted a more internet, because we have the only registry for this disease in the world. And so it comes across as you've got one organization taking over the world kind of thing. And that's not what we want to do, but you want to keep everything in-house. It's not necessarily, so we're working hard to not have any other registries begin and relaying that message that we cannot dilute the data pool. We need to keep the data in-house, and so there's kind of this
And it also
stigma of control.
But it also depends what the board actually has access to, because we've set it up in the projects I've worked on where only certain people have access to the data.
Right.
And so the board isn't going to have access to the data that's in the registry.
Right.
And then on the applications, when I say my board approves it, they see the summary statement, they see the reviewer's comments, they actually don't see the application, and we've actually done that purposefully, so there's a little bit of a separation.
Okay.
And they can always ask me, like I'm kind of the intermediary, and they can always ask additional questions. So I would, and we can talk about this offline, but I would think about the kinds of information people are seeing and what documentation do you need to protect
Right.
everyone. Because if they're not really seeing a lot of stuff, maybe a COI, a conflict of interest, is enough and you don't need an NDA.
And that's kind of the thing, is they do want to see this stuff.
Well, I just tell them
And
they can't.
so-
I set up a governance policy. No, I'm serious. It's in my
Right,
governance
yes.
policy, and my board approved it, that they don't
Right.
see the applications because they also wear funding hats. And then my investigators and researchers feel much more comfortable giving the application because they know it's not all,
Yeah.
the application itself is stopping here. And that building trust is really, really important. And it's taken me sort of several years to get to that point. The other thing we do with peer review with our reviewers is we allow people to opt out of reviewers.
Okay.
But which I
So this is
recommend.
why I need this session.
Yeah. So and it's complicated, and that's a really good point.
Just to clarify, you mean the foundation board, not the board for the registry?
The foundation board,
Okay.
correct? The foundation board of directors.
Now, do you have a board, the governance board for the registry? But that's not what you're referring to.
Correct.
Right.
In this example, and again, every example is different. So in this example, there's no governance board for the registry, and the board of directors approves the information, and there's also samples, the information and samples going out.
Got it.
Yeah, I should have clarified that because we do have our board of trustees that gives the go-ahead. You can't have the data, but we also have a registry charter committee that oversees that, has doctors, and they do see all.
Right, and they're the ones signing the NDAs, so the registry charter committee. And the registry charter committee should because they're seeing all the information. And again, this is what your governance policy does because it's complicated and you're figuring out where are the firewalls and who gets to see what information, and then you write it all down.
We have a question here, Liz.
I just wanted to clarify because you were talking about trust. And to Monica's question, international trust is important. So I think you answered it, but let me make sure. Your governance committee, do people from your international PAG sit on your governance committee?
Can you take the microphone to her? Sorry. Or can you guys get close together?
I can walk.
It's going to make it easier for people at home.
Okay, yes, we do have an international representation of all MDs and PhDs on our charter. So we do, but we want, but the community, because we do have some SYNGAP international organizations, want to also sit in on that charter to the leaders that are responsible for their research on there. And so we were trying to arrange that. So they were like, I don't know if I'm going to sign it on. They're just not sure because I guess they don't understand the process of.
Right, but if they want to sit at that table, the rules for sitting at that table are to sign this agreement.
Okay.
And you can negotiate it because, again, I've negotiated a lot of NDAs, and sometimes there are little tweaks people want to make or things that institutions need to have, and that's fine to negotiate it. But you're setting the ground rules. This is your program. This is the table. If you want to be at this table, this is what you have to do. And then smile when you say it.
Okay.
I was being a little
you.
intense.
So we have a question online, Liz. Do you know of any free or low-cost resources to create and manage governance documents?
So I usually just put them in a Dropbox with not that many people have access to, and I have a Google spreadsheet that keeps that people that need to have access because I have someone that helps me out in logging them and cataloging them. But I just use information sharing tools.
And I think they may be asking about sort of templates that people could use to create a governance document. Is there any example out there?
So, Megan, is any of this in the NCATS toolkit?
There's not enough in the NCATS toolkit or the Radar toolkit, but both resources which are available through NCATS are aware and they're working on it. So Radar is a resource for basically it's how to do a registry for dummies. And had it existed in 2011, I would never be presenting all the lessons I've learned since 2011 because I wouldn't have made all the mistakes that I made. So if you have not started a registry or if you're maintaining a registry, I suggest you go to NCATS page and it's Radar, R-A-D-A-R. I can't specifically talk to those, but that would be the first place to start for resources.
And I would ask other groups, ask groups like you. A lot of people will be happy to share documents.
And don't be surprised if they say, what do you mean governance? Because a lot of groups that may have more money or more resources than you and have been around longer, haven't thought through this because they didn't go to this workshop. Don't let that be permission that you don't need to do this.
But the other thing too is now we have a group of people that are all together at the same time starting to do this. So there might be some good synergies here in terms of working together. And I would say if you find really good templates and resources, let the data do-it-yourself team know because they'll be able to.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Good suggestion. Megan?
I just had a question. Liz, in terms of transparency, should organizations be posting their governance publicly on their website, or is this an internal document? And how often should we be reviewing it?
It's a good question. So I personally don't post the governance document because I view it as an internal document, but I have information about the process in the application instructions that tells people exactly what's going to happen, how long it's going to take, what they have to do, how things get approved, what we're looking for. So it's all there, but that really specific logistical process pieces, that's more internal, but I do have kind of the summary available. And some people make applications available on their website. I personally like to give the application to a researcher because I want to know what you're really trying to do to make sure I have the stuff to help you do it. And again, this is a little more sample-based than data-based, but with the samples we've collected, depending on the research question, our samples might not work for you and it won't help you answer your question. So I don't want you to jump through all these hoops and go through this process when we could have had a quick call for 15 minutes and I could have said, yeah, gee, sorry, I don't have CSF.
What is a realistic amount to charge for cost recovery? And how can you communicate that to the people that are being asked to pay that fee?
That is a very good question. And Megan, I'm just going to jump back really quick. I meant to say you should review it at least annually, but I don't know if I said that. So there are some things about cost recovery, at least on samples. ISBER, the international organization, the International Society for Biorepositories, they have some information. There are other groups. Usually it's anywhere from, I would say, $25 to more for an aliquot. Sometimes people do a two-tiered pricing model where they will charge more to industry and less to academia. Sometimes people will waive fees for a consortium membership, or you might have this key group of this research council you make, or a consortia, and if they're part of it, maybe there's no fee for that. And again, all that goes in the governance policy. For data, when someone is submitting a grant to study something and you're writing them a letter of support, and you're writing them a letter of support to say you're going to give them X data, they can write some cost recovery in the grant. They can write $1,000 in the grant to cover staff time to help pool the data, because it takes human resources to do it and get it ready. And in some fields, people are very open to this, and other fields, they're not, so you might get some pushback, but I really think that we need to provide resources to people that are getting the data ready. And I would really try to get cost recovery in there, because if we all work together to push for it, it will happen. And Sonia, I don't know, do you have any experience with cost recovery in some of your, sorry, not to put you on the spot.
No, it's okay. Not through the Epilepsy Foundation. Through, I think, cost recovery for biological samples is a lot more accepted practice, and I think that that's less likely for people to balk at. Cost recovery for you to send them well-curated survey data, I think is still a wild west in terms of what the best practice is for that. But my philosophy is, try it. If it doesn't work,
if you don't ask, they'll never do it.
Right,
so
exactly.
I would, and ask in your field, talk to other people, and you're going to have some key researchers that are champions. Get their thoughts on it.
We're going through this now, and again, we didn't think about this when we started because we didn't think about governance. Even if you're volunteer family members that are running the registry in the beginning and you're not getting paid, time is still a resource, and an incredible amount of work and money goes into these registries every year. You're paying for the IRB, you're putting in sweat hours, you're paying genetic counselors, and just to hand all of that over for free. And our original thought was, we don't want to create barriers. I don't think $500 is a barrier. But if none of us do it, it's not going to become accepted practice. And I will tell you, Genetic Alliance put out a survey a few months ago, and they have not published the results, but it was about this exact topic. And to Liz's point, people are comfortable charging industry, but they're afraid to charge researchers. And I think there needs to be a larger conversation at these conferences with researchers, maybe even at the Global Gene Summit, about that sweat and hard work and effort that is going into creating this. We're consenting the families, we're recruiting them, we're paying the vendor. I mean, we're saving the other stakeholders a lot. So, all right, I'm off.
So, Pam, Are we okay on time?
Oh, well, we're fine on time. Do we have more comments on that?
Yeah, one more quick question. When we go back to the topic, when is good good? Do you have any benchmark for any level of registry in terms of how many times the information is extrapolated that you know it's good? Is that benchmark, we want it to be reached 5 times by industry and key stakeholders? Do we want 10 times? How do patient advocacy groups know when good is good?
That is a really good question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer for it. I mean, I think if your data is just sitting in one place and is not being used, it needs to be. You need to start moving into good, but I'm not sure. I think I would say at least every year as you get more people using your data, that could be a benchmark, the increase in the number. And I think to John's comments this morning, if it's easier and more accessible, you're going to get more people using it. But I don't know. I wouldn't be comfortable just putting a number on it because I think it's going to be different for different organizations and what kind of data they have.
So are you saying that there are many different factors that you could use to measure whether or not the data is good, but what makes it good in terms of like what's quality data, versus, oh, well, it's shareable, so we're going to use it. What makes for good data?
Well, unfortunately, our benchmark right now is publishing papers. But as we talked about this morning, that's not the best benchmark. But it's a good way, it's the benchmark we currently have, and it's a good way to get people to know about the resource. Mm-hmm. So I would say that would be a minimum, but we're going to need to do better.
So, and maybe talk a little bit about questionnaire design in terms of data quality, the answers you're getting are.
Well, right, so you want to set up, and we did a little bit of this in the first one, you want to set up your questionnaire in a way that you get discrete answers that then can be analyzed, and you don't want to make the questions too complicated. You don't want, if it's patient-reported data, you don't want to make the questions so hard that people can't answer them. I mean, if you ask, I think most of us in the room, if we said, do you have high cholesterol, yes or no, you could answer yes or no. But if we asked you your numbers, you might not be able to include that. So trying to come up with things that people can answer and can answer well.
Hi. Oh, that's loud. I'm wondering if and how groups are engaging with your patient populations when you develop or revise your governance documents or policies, and particularly in terms of understanding how research works. It feels like kind of a difficult intersection to me. Am I making sense? So I'm
keep talking.
That
no, because I think
we should have a board making decisions about governance based on an established policy about guidelines for decision making. So when those guidelines for decision making are developed, is the broader patient population consulted?
Right. So what I always do is I make sure that there's at least, whatever that group is, and I like smaller groups to make decisions. I kind of like 3, maybe 5 if you need to, but three is...
That's not the broader patient population.
No, I know, 3 is a magic number. And you want to have patient representation there, but you could also have a patient advisory board, especially in groups that are marginalized in data collection, where there's a lot of distrust and their data may not have been treated. They're very worried about how their data could be used against them, and there are populations like this. And in that instance, you probably do want to have a patient advisory board to do stakeholder engagement. And like Sonia said, it's not just like 2 phone calls. It does take a lot of work to do it correctly. But I wouldn't, the way we've set up a lot of things is we allow researchers to give us recommendations on the science, but we keep the decision making within the foundation. And so granted, it wouldn't represent the broader patient viewpoint, but there's still always a patient voice there. But you can structure it in multiple ways. And I would just say, don't try to create a really elaborate structure. Start with something small that's a little more nimble and adjust as you need. Because if you are depending on the uniqueness and the challenges within an individual population, you'll realize if if no one's entering their data in their registry because they're not comfortable about how it could be used, you're going to have to do more work to build that out and have that advisory board and have that trust. And I think in rare disease, sometimes we're really lucky because for a patient community, it's generally very, very motivated, and that doesn't necessarily represent other patient communities. They're all a little bit different. Did I answer your question?
What I'm hearing is that it's not feasible
What's not feasible?
to engage the broader patient community in the development of governance.
Well, I think you could, but you would need to do some things to get them up to speed in what you're trying to do, and you could do focus groups, and you could do.
Do people do it?
Could anyone speak to how they've?
Thank you.
You want me to stand again? No, we have a patient advisory council, and for instance, we're doing a research study with a university that's going to be a sub-study out of our registry. And so the clinicians and how we use and utilize our patient our family advisory board is we have 7 on our family advisory board, and they wanted to feedback on the surveys, on the tools they wanted to use. And so we sent the tools and said, can you look over these surveys, and we need all of your feedback, everything, good, bad, ugly, whatever, because we want to make sure that the study, when we design the survey questions, are easy enough. And it actually helps them to understand exactly what you're doing. And really, they become the voice of the organization, where they're like, oh, they are doing something kind of thing, they really are. And involving the community that way. Now, you had a question about educating on research, and I actually stole this idea from Global Genes a while back when they did the meetups. I did. And so, but it works, and I just tweaked it because we don't have a treatment that they used to do, the family meetups with other patient groups that had treatments. And I said, well, I don't have one, so how do I do that? So we have had an incredibly successful family meetup program where we bring in the families. And these meetings, honestly, aren't all that expensive. We're having one in Baltimore. I'm having one in Houston in August. And it's a small group of families, maybe 20 to 35 families come, and we have topics where it's a one-day Saturday conference where we intimately give information to these families, teaching them about the drug development process and putting a more realistic view to what it takes, giving them the information on how to empower them to take ownership of being a part of the research and getting buy-in. And we also do clinics there. So it's like we educate. The families get to meet people they've never met, if they've never met a person with SYNGAP, and then we do a clinic. So there in Edinburgh University, we had our clinic there and got 13 kids in a clinic in 2 days with a meetup. And that just put us on the road to hopefully pre-data for a clinical trial we're going to be working on. So, but we have buy-in now, and now I have, tons of families just excited and they're pumped up about being involved. And it's all about, and this is a teacher in me, I guess, is because knowledge is power. When you give those people the experience, and these are little meetings. And the one in Edinburgh, it cost me about $20,000 because of the, but the ones in the U.S. are a lot less expensive. So anywhere from about $10,000 to feed, educate, bring people in for drug development and things like that.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to bring people together. And I think the other thing, and we talked about this morning, is the people that aren't coming, the people that aren't on the web, that aren't part of Facebook, that aren't part of this community. How do we reach them? Because especially in a rare disease community, sometimes you have this engaged group of families, but the community's a little bit bigger. So trying to figure out how to reach beyond to try to get good representation. But I think just getting feedback from the community is really, really valuable. But just then trying to figure out how to broaden it.
I just have a couple more things I want to get in
Sure.
before the break. One is someone recommended a resource This is a great resource. Registries for Evaluating Patient Outcomes, a user's guide. It's AHRQ.
Oh, that's in our first workbook.
Okay.
Yeah, but that is,
Which
thank
is
you.
also a great resource.
It's a, right, but no, but that the AHRQ one, that's a fantastic resource.
Okay. Then someone asked, there's a couple more quickly. Well, can you expect a platform if it works with other organizations to help with governance? And how's the responsibility divided? Do they provide you anything in the way of governance? You know, like informed consent or?
Right. Well, so I feel like every time I'm saying it depends. So it depends on the platform. But some platforms do have built-in informed consent, so that can actually help you with that. There are also programs to help you do reviews and evaluations that you can track your governance that way. So yeah, I think it would depend on the platform. If we're going to talk about vendor selection. If that's something that's important, that to an organization, you can be asking the vendor, how can your platform help us with governance? But yeah, some things definitely can be built in depending on the platform.
Okay, one over here.
Yes, Candace. So just thinking about your 3-person group, which I love because it makes things easier, and maybe Megan can jump in on this too. Just thinking about your boards, just as a rare disease patient myself, I don't want to shake the tree with my researchers, especially if they're clinicians and they're treating me, because I'm relying on them to keep me alive. But I sit on the board of a nonprofit for a disease group that's not my own disease. So I have no issue approaching our researchers and saying, hey, to recoup the cost, we want $1,000. I'm happy to do that. So I'm wondering if any other groups have done that and utilize your board members that aren't parents or patients to do that versus asking your patients and parents because there's that delicate and intimate relationship with your researchers and you're afraid to make them angry.
No, that's a good point, and I love that you're sitting on another board and helping advocate for that in another situation. I think one of the challenges, though, in a small community, people wear multiple hats. And so when you have someone who's a clinician that then is also a researcher, I think it's really important for them to be very clear on which hat they're wearing at which time, and it gets muddy and it gets blurry. And I think that's where trust is important too. But yeah, thank you for that comment.
I think it's time for us to wrap up.
Yeah, we finished a little bit early.
Well, I have
Yeah.
one more question.
Yeah, sure. It only says yellow down here. It's not blinking red.
Okay, then we're just going to race through that yellow before it turns red. No video cameras here
Yeah.
to stop us. Let's see. We have board members who are renowned researchers. Should they not have access then to the research, how can you mitigate COI?
That's a good question. So, and I think one thing that we haven't talked about yet today, lexicon is really important, and I've been very poor about it up here. I just say board, and sometimes you don't know which board I'm talking about. So you might have, depending on if it's your board of directors or if it's a registry board or a scientific advisory board that reviews things, researchers are quite good about knowing when they're conflicted and stepping out. When they review grants, they have to do this all the time. This is part of their lexicon. So just put a COI in place and ask them to excuse themselves if they have a conflict. But generally, there are some bad apples out there, but the bad apples, their reputation precedes them, and you usually know who they are, and then you can mitigate it that way. But I think most people are pretty good at playing by the rules.
Okay, great. Do we have time? Are you
Yeah.
still yellow? This is it could be a little bit of an ad, I don't know. Where do you find consultants to help with governance if you need somebody's expert advice?
So I think part of it, I would start asking other groups like you what they're doing. And I'm happy people can email me, and they can get in touch with me with the Global Genes group. I'm happy to help you think through it. But some of this actually has to come within. No one can figure it out for you. You kind of have to figure it out yourself. And I think one of the things, so I've been a consultant for a long time, about 15 years. And the reason I do it is because it gives me the flexibility to work on projects that are really, really interesting to me that I'm passionate about. And when you bring in a consultant, you have to be kind of willing to listen to what they say and be open to making changes, because if you're going to bring in a consultant and then you're not going to make any change, it's not really a good use of anyone's time. But I would ask what others are doing, and remember, you don't have to make this complicated. If you write something down and you have somewhere to start with, that's your starting governance policy. It can be a page. And mine is only I think it's only 4 pages. And there's a lot of white space in it. I don't like to read a lot of text. But yeah, it doesn't have to be super complicated.
Liz, I just wanted to follow up with a resource in that space, because you're right, the consultant role is so important with a fresh perspective. But I also wanted to share with everyone a useful resource that I've had for about 15 years in my pocket, whether I've been in Michigan in Ann Arbor or in North Carolina. It's our Center for Nonprofits. Our Center for Nonprofits has a plethora of materials that, although may not speak exactly to the governance of the data, they will speak to governance issues and having governing boards, and there's a lot of materials that are translational. So take advantage of the opportunity that your states likely have a Center for Nonprofits, and there's a number of tools available for you there.
That's a great point. Thank you, Terry.
Anything else in the audience? We have one more question, which is about the legal documentation. So what kinds of things might you need the service of an attorney for to create?
That is a very, very good question. Okay, so we're going to talk about vendor selection. That vendor contract, you want to have someone who is an attorney review it. Unfortunately, contracts are sometimes written in language that's not very friendly. And you need that expertise to protect yourself. And sometimes people use, maybe there's a parent on your board that's an attorney, but you also want someone with subject matter expertise. So you might want to have an attorney look at it and someone that actually knows the space. They wouldn't be doing a legal review, but they would catch things. The lawyer will catch legal things, protections, indemnity, sustainability, that kind of stuff, and then someone who's knowledgeable about the space might catch some other things. And I would say that, when your material transfer agreements, probably that initial one should be reviewed by a lawyer, and when you are negotiating them with institutions, they often have a legal team doing it, so sometimes, depending on how complicated the changes are, you might need to escalate up. But I would say that generally, if you're not sure and uncomfortable, think about getting some legal advice. And there are people that will do it pro bono, so it doesn't always have to be super expensive. But that vendor contract, that's a really important one.
Okay. We have another one that just came in. Governance and licensing data. I heard you mention tiers of pricing. We have had researchers have a problem with the idea of a foundation owning a study and licensing data to industry. How would you explain it to them?
That's a really good question. That's one I'd really like to handle offline and not in a way that's being recorded. So I think it's important as a foundation. In some ways, you could be a research entity and you can collect data and you can own the data, and it's a more innovative way of doing research. I don't think it's nearly as leading edge as it used to be, but I think that researcher needs to kind of get it a little bit in step, because this is the way the world is changing. And I would say, with any of the licensing agreements, that's honestly the part of all these agreements that is the most challenging to me, and that's where I usually get the advice of an attorney.
Okay. Monica?
What kind of attorney?
Oh, here we go.
So actually, your state bar association has lists of attorneys. So if you need someone that has something specific, and if you need a contract attorney, you can always go to them to give you recommendations in your area that are going to know the laws in your state. So anyone who does biotech is usually really good at navigating this space, biotech and tech transfer. But yeah, your state bar association can be a really nice resource because they have lists of attorneys.
She told me I had to stand up. I'm going to do a
Welcome.
switcheroo here. So to go back to old school when Jesus was a baby and research was done, I think that one of the things that really bothers me is the lack of being able to have the key to connect to the research. So just because it's always been done that way, I don't think it needs to continue being done that way. So I'm going to put you on the spot.
And I agree with you.
Okay. So how do we change that? How do we go back to to me, the most natural way to get a natural history is to be able to get those keys and to go back to those studies that have been done, and how do we reconnect with those people where tremendous research has been done and connect it to the registries and come up with a GUID. And you could tell it's like,
No, and
because
here's-
these people are dead. We're never going to get
Right.
information from them.
And here's the thing, going forward, please, 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 please write recontact into your consents. Because we just don't want it to be one study and done. Life is a movie. We need different time points. But because of how the rules are written, it is really hard to go back. And I kind of wish Meg was still here because she might have some more insight into it. But I think everyone recognizes it's a huge problem. But please write recontact into your consents going forward so we don't have that problem. And I'm blinking red now. So I think I have to stop. But thank you so much for the robust question and answer. I really appreciate you all being here and that you're all still awake.